Hello to everyone here. So lovely to see everyone. My name is Cece Manzanares. I'm the administrator for the Goizueta ADRC. So it's a pleasure to see everyone here today. I want to thank all of you for taking time on your Saturday morning to spend with us. I know when you think about what you're going to be doing on a Saturday morning, this maybe doesn't come to front of mind. But for those of you who are relatively new to our research program, this is likely the very first in-person event that you're attending with us. Even though this is actually an annual event, it's only been virtual for the past couple of years. So for those of you who are relatively new to our program, welcome. For those of you who've been with us 4 years, or in some cases almost 20 years, welcome back. So yay, thank you for being here. So I'm sure I speak for all of us here at the ADRC when I say that it is terrific to see everyone here on site together. As you know, we've been able to conduct a lot of our work virtually over the past couple of years, but we also know that takes away that sense of community that we get from events like this. So once again, thank you for being here. I also want to thank everyone here who is part of our research program. We do consider you our study partners, and we're thrilled to have you here with us. As I mentioned, our previous meetings were virtual. We do hope that this signifies our return to in-person events routinely over the next several years. So we're hoping that since this is an annual event, we would love to see each of you here each and every year. So at the end of January, typically, is when we like to bring everyone together. So for those of you, and I can't not mention this, for those of you who we haven't seen recently for a study visit, we have Samantha up here over in the corner. We affectionately call her Sam. And she is computer in hand and willing to set you up for an upcoming visit. So if you haven't been to see us in a while, please do try to take the opportunity to see Sam. And as grateful as we are to have you all here, there are some who are not joining us today. For some of our partners, it was a choice not to be here, but for others, it certainly was not. So as we have in years past, we like to start this program with a reception that honors our participants who we have lost in the past year. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Chad Hales, Dr. Monica Parker, and Dr. Marla Gearing, who will lead us in honoring these participants who have passed in the past year.
Great, thanks, Cece. This time of remembrance gives us an opportunity each year to reflect on the events. It's sometimes hard to see the glass half full when often surrounded by the weight and tragedies of this world, especially in the midst of losing a loved one at the same time, and for those that have traveled so long with us. Reflecting in the middle of winter also seems to make it that much harder, with short days and the sun resting low on the horizon. Indeed, we were in a near state of suspended animation just a few weeks ago with the recent cold snap. Many things sat frozen, including the surface of Lowwater Lake. I'm not sure if any of you got the opportunity to see that near Emory campus. It was remarkable to see the stillness, but at the same time, almost just as remarkable, the occasional goose walking on the surface of a Lowwater Lake. Yes, walking. I recognize that this is a very normal occurrence in the Midwest, but here in Atlanta, Georgia, otherworldly. We have also been reminded of just how small we are in this vast universe, as the James Webb Telescope has captured unbelievable images that peer deeper into our cosmic existence. Trying to grasp the concept of looking back in time by measuring wavelengths of light is truly mind-boggling. 13.8 billion years so far, give or take a few. Finally, we continue to see glimmers of hope for our mission here, to find treatments and understand Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Those who have completed their journey in this last year understood that importance and have contributed greatly. For that, we are grateful. We also know that they could not have done that without you, their families. We are also thankful for that.
At this time, we're going to recall the names of those persons who have given us one of the greatest gifts for research that's conducted here at the Goizueta Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and that is the gift of your brain. You've been with us a long time. We've tested you. We've talked to you for each year, every other year. And the final gift is to learn what our research does and whether or not we've actually made the right diagnoses. So thank you. Thank you to all of our families. Thank you to all of our participants. And certainly thank you for continuing to be a part of this program. Time to remember. Oldest Carver Bird. Joan Coker. William Fink. Carl Hillier. David Hochschild. Bartlett Lewis. Robert Mark McLeod. Jean Mosley. Alva Tabor III. Robert Washington. Robert Young. Again, thank you so much for allowing your relatives to participate in our ongoing Alzheimer's Disease Research Center longitudinal program. We welcome all of you, if you're not yet a part, to continue to be a part and continue your family's legacy. At this time, and these are my final remarks, I'd like to share with you a statement that a family member who couldn't be here wanted to make sure that we all understood and appreciated. He says, "I think it's wonderful that it includes a remembrance of those who are no longer with us. The medications that were developed from earlier research that he used for years really helped slow down the progression of this terrible disease. He was very proud of his involvement in this research." Again, thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you so much for your support of our research program. Thank you.
So in closing, I think Maya Angelou provides a poignant depiction of what we can achieve with her poem entitled A Brave and Startling Truth. However, it is juxtaposed with the starting realization of just how far we have yet to go. Although delivered by Angelou in 1995 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, its words could, unfortunately, never be more true in the light of the many recent tragedies. Interestingly, text of this poem has been around the Earth on the Orion capsule, perhaps as a testament to the heights that we can ultimately achieve. A brave and startling truth. We, this people, on a small and lonely planet, traveling through casual space, past aloof stars, across the way of indifferent suns, to a destination where all signs tell us it is possible and imperative that we learn a brave and startling truth. And when we come to it, the day of peacemaking, when we release our fingers from the fists of hostility and allow the pure air to cool our palms, when we come to it, when the curtain falls on the minstrel show of hate and faces sooted with scorn or scrubbed clean, when battlefields and coliseum no longer rake our unique and particular sons and daughters up with the bruised and bloody grass to lie in identical plots in foreign soil, when the rapacious storming of the churches, the screaming racket of the temples have ceased, when the pennants are waving gaily, when the banners of the world tremble stoutly in the good, clean breeze, When we come to it, when we let the rifles fall from our shoulders and the children dress their dolls in flags of truce, and when religious ritual is not performed by the incense of burning flesh, and childhood dreams are not kicked awake by nightmares of abuse. When we come to it, then we will confess that not the pyramids with their stones set in mysterious perfection, nor the gardens of Babylon hanging as eternal beauty in our collective memory, not the Grand Canyon kindled into delicious color by Western sunsets, nor the Danube flowing into its blue soul of Europe, not the sacred peak of Mount Fuji stretching to the rising sun. Neither Father Amazon nor Mother Mississippi, who without favor nurture all creatures in the depths and on the shores. These are not the only wonders of this world. When we come to it, we, this people on this minuscule and kithless globe, who reach daily for the bomb and blade and dagger, yet who petition in the dark for tokens of peace. We, this people on this mote of matter in whose mouths abide cankerous words, which challenge our very existence, yet out of those same mouths come songs of such exquisite sweetness that the heart falters in its labor and the body is quieted into awe. We, this people on this small and drifting planet whose hands can strike with such abandon that in a twinkling life is sapped from the living. Yet those same hands can touch with such healing, irresistible tenderness that the haughty neck is happy to bow and the proud back is glad to bend. Out of such chaos, of such contradiction, we learn that we are neither devils nor divines. When we come to it, we, this people on this wayward floating body, created on this earth, of this earth, have the power to fashion for this earth a climate where every man and every woman can live freely without sanctimonious piety, without crippling fear. When we come to it, we must confess that we are the possible. We are the miraculous, the true wonder of this world. That is when, and only when, we come to it.
Thank you, Dr. Hales. At this time, I'd like to call on our team of researchers and administrators. Dr. Alan Levy, Dr. James Law, Dr. Felicia Goldstein, Dr. Chad Hales, you've met, Dr. Antoine Trammell, who's new to our family, Dr. Marla Gearing, and Dr. Eric Johnson. We are here to answer questions. And at this time, Dr. Law will give us an update, and Dr. Levy, whatever. It's the Jim and Alan show. Stage right.
We could not be here without all of you. So thank you so much for participating with us. You know, I was just reflecting on Chad's comments today. He started out telling us that how small we are in the universe, but then also he ended up beautifully, poignantly with how wonderful we are as you know, a center here. And it makes me think about all of us. You know, we're part of the universe, and there's a universe of Alzheimer's disease research centers that we work with. And so we are part of a small part, in some ways, of a large global effort to combat Alzheimer's disease. But I like to think about the universe, and we are the star. There are 37 centers around the country that are just like us, but we are the sun, and we is you. We have been the brightest star in the universe, and because of your efforts and partnership with us, we've really been able to work together, but make enormous strides over the last few years alone. And today, we're going to talk about some of the research. Dr. Law and Dr. Hales are going to talk about some of the research that's happening in terms of our ability to diagnose disease earlier and where we are in terms of treatment. And I have been doing this a long time, as you can tell by looking at my hair, but I really feel like we're at a tipping point. The first domino has fallen, and we're really going to start making progress much more rapidly. in this field. So, and we could not do it without every one of you participating with us. So thank you for that. I'm going to not say much more other than turn it over to Jim and Chad so we can hear from them, and then we'll have more time to answer questions. So again, thank you so much. So Chad, I think Jim, you're first.
The names, many of them, all of them, were so familiar. People that have been with us for so long. So it's always, I think Cece always cries at this event. And as I was thinking about this last night, it occurred to me that we are making progress. And it's sad that the progress that's being made was not made in time for many of our families and friends and patients that we've known for so many years. But we are making progress. And so I followed my instructions and I made a few slides. So we are making progress. And I just want to start by reminding everybody something that we've learned, and it's become entrenched over the last couple of decades, but this notion of Alzheimer's disease as a chronic disease, because this is really important. This is where we get the opportunity. And Alzheimer's disease, I just want to remind you all, is a chronic condition that evolves over many years, no different from heart disease or cancer or other chronic diseases. And the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, next slide. What we're seeing on this schematic that we use a lot, the green line on the right that finally starts to go up towards the end of the graph, that represents symptoms of Alzheimer's disease as people lose memory and other abilities and they have functional decline. But what is on the left part of the graph is showing the 15 to 20 years during which Alzheimer's disease is present but evolving silently before people develop disease. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease in clinic, our patients, as soon as they hear the word Alzheimer's, they envision somebody who's severely debilitated, maybe in a nursing home, not able to recognize friends and family. But really, Alzheimer's disease, in our minds now, can extend way back to presence of pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease with no symptoms. Next slide. And one of the important advances is that we can now see the presence of Alzheimer's disease in living people. And what you're looking at here are pictures from something called a PET scan, an amyloid PET scan, where you can see in the warmer colors, in the yellows and reds, those are areas where amyloid pathology is present in living brains. And the thing that's tricky about this is that we can see those pathologies, but I can't tell you from looking at those pictures who has symptoms and who doesn't. Okay. And the other way that we detect these pathologies, so that on the right, you're seeing some of those changes that we see under a microscope. When we look at our friends who've donated their brains and look at their brains under a microscope, we will see a host of changes, including these amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And what we often do, and many of you, some of you in the audience have participated in this, and those hands in the picture on the right, those belong to Dr. Hales, and that butt that you can barely see is my butt. When we collect spinal fluid, we do that because we can measure proteins associated with those plaques and tangles in the spinal fluid that tell us whether there is or is not Alzheimer's disease. It may be silent, but it's still Alzheimer's disease inside the brain. What you're seeing here is an aggregation of some of the data that we've collected here over the years. And what the bars represent are individuals who have evidence of Alzheimer's pathology, and the bars represent different age groups. So you can see that even in our participants, our volunteers who are between the ages of 50 and 55, 4.7% of them have Alzheimer's disease in their brains. By the time we get into our volunteers over the age of 75, what is that number? 28, 32. So about a third of our volunteers over age 75 have Alzheimer's disease in their brains. And these are all cognitively normal people, people without any symptoms of memory loss or anything else. And they have Alzheimer's disease inside their brains. So we can detect that. What we cannot yet detect or tell is where they are in that 15 to 20-year process. So is somebody who has Alzheimer's disease, based on our measurements of those spinal fluid proteins, are they a year away from developing early memory loss, or are they 20 years away from developing early memory loss? And we don't know how to discriminate that. In fact, about a third of our normal donors who donate their brains across our Alzheimer's Centers network, about a third of them who were cognitively normal when they died have abundant evidence of Alzheimer's disease in their brains, but they never developed any symptoms. So this is a major challenge for our day today. Next slide. And the reason we collect spinal fluid, one of the things that Alan and Chad and Eric and all of the rest of us here who do Alzheimer's research, we insist that anything that we believe has to do with something going on with Alzheimer's disease, I don't trust it if it just comes out of a mouse model. Mice don't get Alzheimer's disease. We insist that those things that we believe are related to Alzheimer's disease are reflected in some way in what's going on in the brain. And there are a host of changes happening in the brain in people who develop Alzheimer's disease, not just those plaques and tangles, but many, many other processes that are going on. And the reason we study these things in the spinal fluid is that picture on the right. All the white areas in that picture represent places where the spinal fluid is. And it's an intimate contact with the brain. And so we can measure things that are going on in the brain using the spinal fluid that we can't do in any other samples, at least not yet. I'm hoping next year or the year after, Dr. Johnson, who's sitting over here, is going to tell us how he's translated some of these things from brain to spinal fluid and then to blood. But this is why we study this stuff in the spinal fluid. Next slide. And one of the really cool things that we can do now, what you're seeing here are those dots represent individuals, and the green dots represent individuals who are normal and have no Alzheimer's disease in their brains. And then the dots in the red are people who have Alzheimer's disease in their brains and have developed cognitive impairment or dementia from Alzheimer's disease. So we can separate them, and this is separated based on patterns of proteins in their spinal fluid. So what you're seeing in the middle there, and the orange, is are individuals who are normal, no cognitive problems, but they have Alzheimer's disease in their brains. And what we can now do is, using data analysis methods, we can now look at those individuals. Now, just the orange dots, those people who are normal but have Alzheimer's disease in their brains, we can examine a host of proteins in their spinal fluid, and we can say some of these people look more like those normal people with no pathology, and some of these people cluster along with people who have Alzheimer's disease and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. We think what this means is that we can take people who are healthy, who have evidence of Alzheimer's pathology, and start to guess or discern who is closer to disease and who is not. And that's what we need to do. That sort of gap in our knowledge is really, really important for us to fill, because changes are coming. And this is intended to show the course of dementing illnesses. It doesn't matter if it's Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body or anything else. But degenerative brain diseases progress over time, and there is that long preclinical phase of asymptomatic disease, which is our window of opportunity. And the problem with these diseases is, in later stages, life becomes pretty miserable. But what Dr. Hales is going to tell you about for a few minutes is the recent development and the availability of the first drug ever that will become available this year that can help slow down the progression of Alzheimer's disease if we capture people early enough in their disease. And that's today. That's now. Next slide. But where we want to go is we want to attack this process even earlier and be able to prevent disease, because slowing progression is good, but if we can delay the onset or prevent the development, that's better. And that's ultimately how we win against Alzheimer's disease, is by pushing it further and further back. And that 15 to 20-year silent period is an incredible opportunity for us to deploy preventative treatments. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hales now.
Excellent. So, one of the approaches to Alzheimer's disease is, well, how do you remove or change some of those things in the brain? And you've heard Alan mention that maybe we're near that tipping point. You've heard Jim talk briefly about some of those changes in the brain and maybe being able to predict people who are going to develop disease. Well, what if you have a medication that can remove some of those things, some of those plaques, some of the amyloid? Before I go on to chat a little bit about that, I want to know what my audience knows. So who has heard the word lecanemab? Okay, how about the word Leqembi? Pretty limited. Okay, so how about aducanumab? Let's try that one. Okay, maybe a couple of more. All right. So, this is a class of medications that removes amyloid, one of the proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease, kind of like sweeping the brain clean of amyloid. And one of the approaches over the last couple of decades has been, well, what if we can remove that amyloid? Will patients see improvement clinically, or less decline, or delayed decline, or perhaps even not even develop symptoms at all? And so that's the approach. I'm not going to go into some of the challenges with that approach because there have been a few, just to say a few, more than a few, and a lot of failures. But the excitement now is that with lecanemab, as you may have seen, it does seem to reduce the amount of cognitive decline in patients on medication versus patients who are taking a sugar pill. Okay, this is tested in large trials and is something that, as Jim mentioned, is technically available now, although there are still some challenges to sort out, and I'll try to move through those a little bit so we have a good feel of, well, what does that mean for actual availability for the medication? There are still some caveats in that these medications are tested in very well-controlled trials. And so when you put these medications into real-world practice, we don't actually know all of the different things that we might see. Will we see things that look better than what we saw in trials, or will we see things that maybe don't look as good as what we see in trials? And that's the part that's unknown, but also the important part from us as care providers to try kind of track things as you're on these medicines to see, are you really seeing some true benefit? So where do we stand? So lecanemab was recently approved via the accelerated process by the FDA in early January. What that means is they reviewed one of the smaller scale trials for lecanemab and said that they see that amyloid is removed by the medication and that there's a hint that the cognitive decline is less in the patients on the medication. That's what that accelerated approval was based on, is that smaller trial. The very same day, January 6th, the company that makes the medication submitted a full application to the FDA, which means, well, we don't really want this accelerated approval because it makes it available, but there are restrictions. There are some strings attached to who can actually receive that medicine. And it all boils down to cost, right? Who's going to pay for it? But they applied for full approval that same day. And so that is kind of where we are with the process, is that the FDA has that full application, and we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern for them to review a larger scale trial. What you'll hear is a phase 3 trial. in which there were hundreds of subjects in that trial that did show that cognitive benefit as well. It's certainly not a cure. It's certainly not the absolute best treatment. But as you've already heard, it's probably going to be a good start. And so where do we go over the next few months? Well, we'll kind of wait to hear what FDA has to say as we move over the next few months. The bigger piece to this is, again, the cost. Is Medicare going to pay for it? And there are some nuances to that with respect to how they reviewed aducanumab, which you may have seen some of the controversies around that approval. I haven't talked too much yet about side effects. What have you heard? And if anybody's who's heard lecanemab, what have you seen in the news that about the side effects that lecanemab may have? Yes, ma'am. Okay, I hear so up front, something about bleeding. What have others heard? Yes, ma'am. Inflammation. Man, you guys are great. So absolutely. So these are really the two pieces of side effects that we do see in these trials. Is that, let's kind of put it in perspective. The way the medication works is it's an antibody. So, antibodies help fight infections in your body. They fight bacteria, they fight viruses. Well, this medication is an antibody that binds to amyloid, that protein that's up in your brain. And there's also some amyloid, not only in the brain tissue, but in the blood vessel walls up in your brain. And just like an inflammatory response, if you get your flu shot and your arm hurts after the flu shot, you've got inflammation and swelling in your arm. In some patients, they develop some swelling when that antibody binds to the amyloid up in the brain and in the blood vessel walls. And when that happens, you do get some swelling, and sometimes you get some tiny microhemorrhages or little tiny bleeds in the brain. The side effects that patients may feel from those are pretty minimal. So most patients who have those, they're asymptomatic, which means you're just kind of keeping an eye on it. There's a lot of surveillance involved, so several different brain scans over the first year to make sure that you're safe on the medication. There are a couple of cases where the side effects were perhaps a bit more robust, and there'll certainly be more to come on that as we move forward. What we know is that when you compare aducanumab, kind of the first hit about a year or so ago with lecanemab, is that the side effect profile is maybe about half with lecanemab. So a little bit better, but still present, and will certainly be part of the risk-benefit discussion when you chat with your provider about this. The other piece to the medication that Dr. Law alluded to is, well, who might the medication benefit the most? And in the trials, it was patients who were very mildly impaired. So patients kind of fitting in that category of what we call mild cognitive impairment, which I think he showed on the slide. It's really kind of that gray zone where you're still very independent, but having subjective symptoms and some evidence of changes on your pencil and paper testing. Or very mild Alzheimer's disease dementia. So maybe you're having a couple of mild, maybe you're having a little trouble with your finances or a little trouble with your medications, but still very independent. And what we don't know as we move forward is whether this type of medication may even be more beneficial if you give it earlier. And in fact, there's a trial ongoing now to try to answer that question. So that's kind of where we are, is we're waiting on a little bit more information from the FDA, a little bit more information from Medicare. If FDA fully approves this medication in the next few months, then we anticipate Medicare will cover it. And then becomes the logistical hurdles that we've been chatting about frequently on our side, which is, how do you deliver a medication which requires infusions? I have not mentioned that yet. It is an infusion-based medicine, which means every 2 weeks you have to go to an infusion center, perhaps have home health. There's still some stuff to sort out there, but it's placing an IV, getting an infusion every 2 weeks. And the trial was 18 months long. So, folks were on this medication for a while, and we don't have full guidance on how long you need to be on the medicine for it to be of benefit. We do know that it clears the brain of amyloid really well. It's just what happens when it's gone. If you stop the medicine, do you see changes? Does the amyloid come back, and over what time frame? Well, still a lot of nuances there. So like I said, certainly not the perfect medication, has some side effects, requires infusion, but is a good first step as you've heard mentioned. I think I'll stop there on that.
Okay, at this time, I'd like Dr. Goldstein, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Trammell to come up front. I'm going to introduce them again in case you forgot them. This is all part of our research team, our investigative team. Dr. Felicia Goldstein is a neuropsychologist and part of our co-director of our clinical core. Dr. Alan Levy directs the entire center. Dr. James Law is I call him his wingman, but he is our director of our clinical core. And even though we have some titles out there, we all do a lot of different things. Marla Gearing is a co-director of our pathology core. She is the person who does the autopsies on the brains that have been donated. So she is the pathologist who assists with these, and she's very dedicated to her task, very particular. And Dr. Johnson is one of our clinicians and investigators. Dr. Trammell is director of our Georgia Memory Net that's housed at Grady Memorial Hospital. And he has his own studies that are going on here at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. You've met CC Manzanares, who's our administrative lead. You have not necessarily, you know who she is, but you don't know what her role is. Mrs. Cornelia Dorbin is co-director of the Outreach, Recruitment, and Education Core, as well as the Minority Engagement Core. And I'm your director of Outreach, Recruitment, and Education and Minority Engagement. How many of you have watched Brain Talk Live? Okay, I need more of you to watch Brain Talk Live because that's our outreach and our educational arm for everybody. And in April, we'll be having our 24th Brain Health Forum that we've been doing for the last almost 14 years now. And we hope to see all of you there. It's another opportunity to learn more. So this is our opportunity for you to ask questions for the people assembled in front of you. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Respond with Dr. Trammell and I are doing a study. It's 5 centers across the United States. We're one of them. It's a NIH-supported trial to look at factors associated with successful cognitive aging. So much of the literature has been focused on people who don't age well and get diseases as they age, but this particular study is looking at people 80 and older who have normal cognitive aging or super aging, meaning they're functioning at the level in terms of their memory of people who are 50 and 60-year-olds. So we're looking for people, volunteers who are 80 and older with normal cognition. You'd come into our center, you'd still be part of the Alzheimer's Center, but in addition, we'd have you come back and take some additional cognitive tests, a specialized brain scan, and some other measures as well every 2 years. So we're hoping to get some volunteers. Some of you are already in our study, and thank you for participating.
Could someone tell us what the procedure is if you have donated your brain?
If you want to
Go to
donate
the-
your brain.
Yep. I'm going to give this over to Dr. Gearing to answer that question. I just wanted to add something that's really important to Felicia's comments about the super aging study. You know, we often focus on the symptoms, the disease, but what Jim talked about was so many people have Alzheimer's pathology, but they don't have impairment in their memory. And the super ager study really is going to allow us to understand what keeps a brain resilient, what protects people. So rather than focusing on the disease, we also want to start focusing much more aggressively on how to keep people healthy. So now let me ask Marla.
What is the procedure if I want to donate my brain?
Okay.
What happens when I die and so forth?
Okay, so if you, like the before death piece is, you're being followed in our research studies and you indicate your intent, make sure your family members know. And then at the time of death, we have a 24-hour answering service. They will get in touch with the person on call who 99.99% of the time is me. And I will talk to the next of kin of the decedent and take consent for the autopsy. By Georgia law, we cannot do that ahead of time. You have to do that. Even though you filled out all these papers ahead of time, you have to do the actual consent at the time of death with the next of kin. So we do that. Then I arrange for transport. The body is transported to Emory University Hospital where the brain and the spinal cord are removed. And then after that, we contact the funeral home of your choice, and they will come and go from there with whatever arrangements you've made. The brain itself, we serve a lot of different research studies, different types. So people need different types of tissue. So what we do is we basically, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We cut the brain in half along the midline, and half of it is frozen. So that kind of tissue can be used for certain research studies. And then the other half we preserve, and that's the half that we use for the diagnostic workup. About, a week or two later, we go in, we take a lot of little pieces from all different areas of the brain and look at those under the microscope. And that will tell us, what all was going on. Was this Alzheimer's? Was this Alzheimer's and 5 other things contributing, which is very common in the elderly. And then once all of that process is completed, we prepare a report, and the family is contacted. The next of kin is contacted and actually provided with a copy of the autopsy report. That can take up to 6 months. But that's what we do. So did that answer your question? And then the tissues, of course, are distributed for research as people request them.
Yes. You right there with the mask, right there where Deja is.
Jim reminded me, some people often have questions about funeral arrangements after a brain has been removed. Brain removal is compatible with open casket funerals, viewing, all of that. I speak from personal experience. My grandfather donated his brain, and we had an open casket funeral with him. So it is certainly compatible. And we generally our turnaround time is generally less than 24 hours. So if you, for some reason, need to have a funeral very quickly afterwards, we can usually make that happen too.
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of the efforts to accelerate diagnosis, starting earlier and earlier and earlier, does this affect the frequency that you want to do the spinal taps? I think at one time it was maybe every 2 or 3 years, but will this, in part, as part of this effort, will the spinal taps be occurring more often, or does it matter?
No, it's a great question. So we want to try to get away from doing spinal taps. Of course, no one really wants to have a spinal tap done. They're not that bad, really, but we want to try to make it easier. So in most areas of medicine, we use biomarkers from blood, from plasma. When you get a blood draw, right, you go to your primary care doctor, you're getting your cholesterol checked. For instance, you're taking a look to see how your kidney function is through your blood. We want to do the same thing for our research program for Alzheimer's disease. So we're putting a lot of research effort right now into translating what we're doing with spinal fluid into blood. And we're not there yet, but we're making great progress. So we do want to monitor more frequently, but logistically, to do that, we're really going to need to be able to access other fluids like blood rather than spinal fluid.
Bill?
Thank you. Now that we've learned more and more about our genetics, and I just follow this on the internet, and it seems like you were saying, you cut a log in half. I happen to turn wood. It's different on both sides, so that if you take one half, you're not getting the same thing as if you get the other half. But medically speaking, looking at our genetic structure, even if a person is an identical twin, now that they've found the nano layer, they're not identical at all. And this really screws up a lot of the studies and the basis we've used for this. So I begin to see a little bit more of this on the internet, but not a whole lot. So maybe my former neighbor Alan up here can lead us into some information about that.
Thanks for that tough question, Jim. The genetics of our understanding of the genetics of Alzheimer's disease continues to accelerate, and it gets more and more complicated, as you mentioned. And that's why we sometimes hear things that seem to be conflicting or confusing. It turns out there are over 75 genes now that we each inherit, 2 versions, the 2 copies of each gene from our parents. Each parent gives us one. And so there's 75 different genes which contribute a little bit of risk or protection. So every one of us is a little bit different. And so there's not a simple genetic test for the vast majority of people. Having said that, a very rare form of Alzheimer's disease, about 1% of individuals, develops it with a very strong gene that causes a single mutation, causes the disease. Those families too have been incredibly important. Dr. Johnson can talk about some of the advances in the biomarkers because of the work that can get enabled by those strong families. But it doesn't pertain to the vast majority of us. But all these genetic studies, whether it's a very strong gene or these other genes, are crucial because they give us really unprecedented understanding of the causal mechanisms, the things that are really directly leading to the disease. It's the only thing that we know for sure can say these things are really contributing and have a role in causing the disease. So Jim mentioned all the changes that happen in the brain beyond the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many different genetic pathways that are getting activated that lead to the disease.
So I just want to add another component to that. Genetics. So we know that the two most important risk factors for Alzheimer's disease are age and genetics, right? But think a little bit about age and what that means. And one of the things that I think we're going to learn in the coming years is that non-genetic factors, something that you will hear more about, something that we refer to as social determinants of health. So this is everything from the time that you're conceived up to the present, what you've been exposed to, where you live, what opportunities you had, what traumas you suffered, the social environment, the cultural environment, the crap that's happening in Memphis. All of those kinds of things play a role in outcomes. And I think what we're going to learn is that those non-genetic factors are going to wind up playing as maybe even a bigger role than the overall genetic background in terms of determining health and disease risk.
I'm just going to add one other thing because it's so important. We haven't really stressed it today, and that's the importance of lifestyle, managing exercise, diet, all the things we talk about for brain health sort of are in the spectrum of activities that are the social determinants of health in some way. They're not so much social, they're personal lifestyle choices. There was a fantastic study of genetically identical twins last year where the individuals had PET scans to show the amount of amyloid and the amount of neurofibrillary tangles in their brain. And yeah, it confirmed that genetics plays a pretty strong role. You could predict which of the people were twins by looking at their brain scans. That's how similar they were. But there were also some of the individual twins that had very, very different amounts of amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles, despite them being genetically identical. And you know what the difference was between them? Those that had fewer plaques and tangles were the ones that were more socially interactive, didn't suffer from depression, and were more physically active. So really important to really focus on those things that you can control and your choices to exercise, to sleep well, to have a Mediterranean diet, anti-inflammatory diet. Most importantly, wake up every day with a purpose in life, stay engaged, and interact with people.
Deja is next, and then Bill, and then this young lady. Right.
Pickleball, that's all I'm going to say.
Okay. A question for Dr. Daring. What if you move out of state and you've donated your brain and spinal cord?
We have had that. It's helpful if we make arrangements in advance, but we had, there's a network of people, neuropathologists all over the country that we can get in contact with. They make arrangements. We have also had occasions, at least two that I can think of, where a participant was on vacation and died unexpectedly. And we've been able to work with medical examiner or local pathologists to obtain the brains from those people. So it can certainly be done.
Bill?
Yeah, my question's on the brain donation as well. If my loved one is an organ and tissue donor, that happens first and then the brain, or do you need the brain within 24 hours?
The the organ donation would happen first. Yes, that happens first. And we need to know about that in advance, and so that we can coordinate with whatever organization you've arranged, if you've like Lifeline or something.
Lifelink of Georgia.
Yes,
it would
yeah.
be. Okay, thank you.
Right here and then there. Right here. You just talk, stand up and talk. He's trying to bring you on my phone.
My husband, is it on?
Yes.
Okay. My husband tested with MCI for 2 years and then tested normal the 3rd year. Then the 4th year was back to MCI. Dr. Law knows about this. And we didn't know that you could test normal after testing with MCI.
Carver was just a troublemaker. So, and this is, it's a really complicated question, and also if the question really had to do with people who might be classified as mild cognitive impairment or MCI, and then next visit be classified as normal, cognitively normal, and then maybe bounce back to mild cognitive impairment again. And it points to several different things. Part of it is that the way we evaluate things clinically is noisy, right? So it's not like doing a lab test where you get precise numbers. If you had if you hadn't slept well the night before you came in for your research visit, maybe your attention is not as good. Or another day you just did really well, and the test scores are normal. And so they can bounce back and forth. But what's really fascinating is when you try to correlate that with the pathology, it doesn't work terribly well. And in fact, that's why we need to learn more about all of the elements that go into developing symptoms as well as promoting resiliency. So it may be that some people have evidence of Alzheimer's pathology, and maybe they are experiencing some symptoms, but they have resilience factors that allows them to hold on, so they kind of bounce back and forth a little bit. So it's a question that is really important, and I don't have a good answer. And like I said, I think it's just because Carver was a damn troublemaker.
One thing that is really important as this new drug lecanemab comes out, we didn't talk about it when Chad mentioned it, but when we're going to want to treat people as early as possible, including mild cognitive impairment, but we won't be able to do it until people have either a spinal tap or a PET scan to confirm the amyloid is present. So we certainly don't want to treat people that don't have it.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. There's one over there. There's Bill and this young lady right here. I've got 3 minutes, I've been told. Okay, up on it.
Good morning, doctors and teams. My question is, are there any links to severe trauma causing this disease?
Links to severe trauma causing this disorder. Head trauma.
Advertising Antoine.
Like in football players, people was, and boxers, I mean, they are at risk for problems with their memory and thinking as the trauma progresses. The more trauma that you experience, the worse for your brain. Is there a link between that trauma and Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
There is.
Well, and Chad might want to chime in about CTE. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just chime in briefly, I guess. So there is a broader association with traumatic brain injury and some type of cognitive impairment later in life. The way those associations are determined are really by looking at lots of different studies and then trying to put together, well, what's the absolute risk for that? And there's certainly a risk association, but the challenge is, how do you attach a particular traumatic brain injury or series of traumatic brain injuries that may have occurred 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, to the onset of symptoms. And I think that's what's been difficult with attaching trauma to the specific changes in the brain. Certainly, there's been a lot of talk, especially in the media, in looking at chronic traumatic encephalopathy and some of the changes in a protein called tau. That's TAU, the same protein that gets deposited in the brains of folks who have Alzheimer's disease, and showing that, well, maybe there's a distinct type of that tau that you can see under the microscope that characterizes what's going on in the brains of these folks that may have had repetitive brain injuries, perhaps with football or other things. As to, again, that association, somewhat hard, I guess, to attach that, but there's I think a lot of work still trying to look at it and understand, well, what can you do to perhaps prevent it? And I think common sense says, well, don't get a traumatic brain injury.
Would you recommend Tua to continue to play football?
Yeah, I don't know about that. No. You know, the common sense stuff, right? If you ride a bicycle, wear your helmet. If you're riding in a car, wear your seatbelt. You know, all these types of things. If you're skiing, people don't think about it as much skiing. Wear a helmet. I mean, all these types of things where if you're going a lot faster than you should be on your own legs, you should probably be wearing a helmet. Because the bottom line is all it takes is one. And really you have to kind of discern between, well, what's the acute events of a trauma, which can be very bad, versus what's this longer term risk, which we're still learning as we move forward.
Bill, and then this young lady up here. Last two questions.
I just want to compliment the process. In November, my family member donated brain and spinal cord, and Marla did indeed call me back. We live about an hour from here, and I carried that card in my pocket, wondering what would happen, ready to spring into action. And she made it so easy. She was calm and compassionate, and that helped me stay calm. And within 30 minutes or 40 minutes, transport was there. And it was at night, like 9:30. And by lunchtime the next day, the funeral home was very impressed that she was ready to be picked up. And she looked beautiful, and it was amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Stand.
I do wonder, when we get the report, I have some doctor kids who will be very interested. Will it be very specific in terms of plaque and tables?
Very detailed, yes.
Thank you.
And we're always available to, if you have additional questions, happy to answer additional questions.
I had a question about sleep and Alzheimer's. I read somewhere that when you sleep, it kind of restores the brain and almost heals it. Is there any evidence that people who have insomnia have a greater chance of getting Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's an area of research right now. Clearly, you have to have good sleep to have good cognitive function the next day. What are the long-term effects of sleep deprivation down the road? This is particularly important to people up here who have gone through residency, or shift workers, right? Who don't get regular sleep. During sleep, our brains are very active, right? They are clearing waste, they're forming memories. It's a very important time. You want to get good, deep wave sleep. So sleep hygiene, that's not watching, TV right before you go to bed, the bright lights, not drinking caffeine for dinner, having a coffee or at dinner time. These are all very important to get that good, deep wave sleep. So I think we're going to learn more about the absolute risks down the road of poor sleep in midlife and later. But clearly, it's a potential risk factor.
This concludes you got one more?
To that question, Dr. Goldstein and I have been looking at superagers in a national data set from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. And when we compared people who met the criteria to be superagers versus those who were just cognitively normal, there was a big difference in depression, but also sleep. The people who met criteria to be superagers reported less problems with sleep apnea and insomnia. So not only does it affect your ability to maintain your thinking and memory, but it might actually help you, go to the next level and be a super ager too.
So if you have a sleep disorder, you need to see a sleep disorder specialist. One more? Can I do it? Cornelia says yes. One more. One more is one more. Mr. Mayfield, okay.
Maybe this is a closer. A few years back, I sat on a panel with researchers looking at cancer, and they began to look at ways of examining whether should be approach to inoculation for cancer, to prevention of cancer. Do you think we'll ever get to that stage with Alzheimer's? Is anybody thinking in that sense?
A vaccine for Alzheimer's?
Sure, I can field that. So actually, one of the first trials in Alzheimer's disease was with a vaccine. And it was a vaccine that was against the amyloid beta protein. This is fascinating. They think about where we've come over these decades. The problem with that trial is that we couldn't control the response of the immune system. So some people developed a very strong response, had massive inflammation in their brains and died from that. And the trial was stopped. Now we infuse the antibodies so we can control the response and dial it in or back as needed to have those plaques cleared. I think eventually, as a preventative, we would like to think about giving people a vaccine to amyloid in their 40s, in their 50s, so that before they have plaques in their brain, so they may never develop plaques in the first place because the immune system is attuned to that now, like, say, a COVID vaccine, and clears that before it ever happens. That would be a wonderful preventative primary care development for Alzheimer's disease.
But this will also hinge on whether studies like what Jim mentioned identify other factors that may be more important for Alzheimer's disease. Perhaps amyloid is not the target, right? Maybe we need a vaccine against something else or another molecule that may help.
Okay, this really does end our question and answer session. I'd like you, before you leave, first of all, Cornelia says you need to leave your name tags. Just leave them on the table. We'd appreciate that. Second, if you look at your program, this is a list of our upcoming programs with links to how you can access our programs. If you've never seen Brain Talk Live, you've never been to one of our forums, we have them all recorded on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something, you can go there and you can look and you can learn again, you can watch it again, and you can share this information with your friends. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for your continued participation. We look forward to seeing you more.